Hey, this is Ryan Holiday. Obviously, one of the perks of my life is that I get to have conversations with the great Robert Greene. I think one of the best living writers on the planet, author of, as you can see here, Mastery, The Laws of Human Nature, The 48 Laws of Power, The 33 Strategies of War, 50th Law, and The Art of Seduction. We have these phone conversations every couple weeks, and so what he and I thought we would do is we said, why are we just doing this privately? What if we just got on Zoom and recorded it and people could listen? Because maybe some of the things that we're going through, that we're thinking about, some of the stuff that's influencing his writing could be beneficial to everyone. We talk about the rampant irrationality of our time. We talk about political polarization. We talk about falling for scams and cons, which I think is its own pandemic these days. We talk about conspiracy theories. I love talking to Robert. I feel like I've been having these conversations with him since I was 18 or 19 years old, and it has transformed how I see the world. It's helped make me into the writer that I've been lucky enough to become. So I'm so excited to share this with you. Here is my interview with the great Robert Greene. There's this line from Churchill that I like where he talks about as World War II is breaking out. He says, it felt good today to put 1,000 years between me and the 20th century, meaning he was reading and writing about history as a way of calming himself down and getting perspective. And I feel like your books are a great opportunity for people to understand the present by looking at the past.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I agree with the fact that it's kind of calming. It gives you perspective. It makes you realize that the bad days will end, that we're in a particular cycle of history, and that nothing lasts forever. In my last kind of podcast, I was talking about irrationality, and I brought up the story of Pericles and of the plague that hit Athens, kind of drawing a comparison a little bit with COVID. Although obviously I recognize the plague is not the same thing as the coronavirus, but it was sort of as a metaphor for what we're going through and the kind of irrationality that erupted in Athens, kind of triggered by this very powerful plague, to give people a sense of 2,000 years, essentially, of perspective on this, or more than 2,000 years, of how these cycles occur and how outbreaks of irrationality occur even in the richest times in history, which is 5th century BC Athens, the height of what we would call rationality, and that it led to a whole century, the 4th century BC in Athens, of incredible irrationality, of superstitious beliefs. It was also the period of Plato and Aristotle, so it was very contradictory. But these things happen in waves. People go crazy, they go insane collectively. It's not just a pandemic of a virus, it's a pandemic of emotions, of irrationality that people can't handle. So very much I agree with you. History gives you a deep sense of perspective and can help you lift some of the depression that comes from being mired in a moment that seems so chaotic.
Well, it's interesting. Yeah, you read your books and it's filled with stories of irrational people and con men, and it's filled with stories from history. And I think maybe we look at those and we go, oh, that was a long time ago. It's different now. And then we're surprised when we see those traits or those tendencies reemerge in our modern world.
It's hard for a human being to have perspective, particularly on its own period of time. And you said, this time it's different. That's the classic phrase that people used when there was like some kind of bubble, like the South Sea bubble or the crash in 2008. Some new scheme comes for making money, which is clearly like an elaborate...
Cryptocurrencies and...
Yeah, right. And it's obviously an elaborate type of Ponzi scheme. And everybody kind of points to, well, look at the past. There were all these other kind of, schemes going on, and look how they ended. And they go, no, this time it's different. One thing I talk about in the 48 Laws I think is very relevant. I talk a lot about how to form a cult, charlatans and con artists. And the thing about a cult is when you're in a cult, you have no idea that you're in it. So you might be in one right now, you, Ryan Holiday, or me, Robert Greene, but I wouldn't realize it because the nature of a cult is it envelops you in a narrative of this is what the world is. These are our enemies out there. This is our cause. This is what unites us. And it creates this kind of fake and very simple and vague narrative of what the world is like. And when you're in that bubble, you don't realize that you're in it, because by the nature, if you did realize you were in a cult, you wouldn't be in a cult any longer. So that's the kind of danger that people are living in right now. This is a time where con men and charlatans are proliferating. No, and as I said in the book, when you go through a period of transition where great, big, grand belief systems, such as Christianity or organized religion, particularly in the West, or communism or something like that, falls apart, people need to believe in something. It's a deep human need. And when that disappears, we're going to start believing in these little microcosms, these little mushrooms that emerge after the rain, with all these sort of little kind of belief systems that kind of combine technology and religion, etc.
I'm not sure I've ever been in a cult, but certainly, and I know you saw some of it, American Apparel, Dov Charney was able to create kind of a cult-like atmosphere inside the company. And one of the things I found to be most strange about it, and I kind of had one foot in, one foot out, especially towards the end, because I always was doing my own things, it would be when there would be obvious flaws or faults. So, you're being criticized, or it's being sued, or there's the front page of the New York Times is arguing this or that. What I noticed is that instead of that waking people up, it drove them deeper into the narrative. And obviously the scientific term for this is cognitive dissonance. I'm curious how you see cognitive dissonance playing out these days.
Well, cognitive dissonance is like the golden principle right now. And essentially what it means is you believe in something, you come to believe in something for whatever reason. And when evidence comes in that what you believe in is patently false, it confronts you with a dilemma. Either you were kind of stupid in the beginning to believe in this in the first place. And as the philosopher Schopenhauer says, people will admit to anything, but they will never admit to being stupid or having less intelligence than another.
Sure.
So it's very difficult to admit that you were stupid. It's like the last thing someone will confess to. So the alternative is, instead of believing the evidence, you double down on your initial belief and you say, it's the other person who's wrong. And you see this all the time. Like, there's this scare that Antifa is coming to Idaho and is coming to your small town. And it's just like Facebook hoax. It's a complete hoax. Somebody was pulling their leg. And so hundreds of people come out with their AK-47s to defend their little town in Idaho against the Antifa that are coming. And of course, they never come. And then they say later on, it's clear that it was a hoax, but they say, no, we scared them from coming because we were there. Or that congressman in Texas, Gomert, he's ranting against masks helping in the coronavirus. And then he catches the coronavirus, the ultimate irony.
Right.
And then he says, it was the masks that caused him to have it. These are cognitive biases that are happening at left, right, and center. And everyone's going to see through this, but if you voted for a president, for instance, or a leader, and it ends up that person is not what you thought he was or she, it's obviously a charlatan, a con artist. That's the ultimate thing. You have to admit that you were conned, and nobody wants to admit that. So you'll double down on your belief that this person is right. Then you'll be even fiercer in your defense against these enemies that he or she is facing.
I feel like that's kind of the ultimate message through all your books, whether we're talking about planning strategy and 33 strategies, or whether we're trying to build some power dynamic, or we're trying to achieve mastery in a field. I feel like the thread through all your books is this sort of an unflinching commitment to reality, even when it's inconvenient, even when it means you have to go, oh man, that was so dumb. Why did I do that? Or whether it's taking responsibility for a failure or a mistake. That it seems like, and I think you say, like, we have to take to reality like a spider to its web.
Right. I mean, you probably know this. I mean, you have to understand people. It's not like I'm accused, like I'm somehow exempt from human nature. So I understand the process, but I'm actually not as secure and certain of myself as people think I am. Whenever I hold a belief or I'm writing a book, I always start with the premise that I'm probably wrong, that I'm actually quite ignorant, that my idea is pretty stupid. And I look at the evidence on the other side and I examine it and I try and convince myself that my initial idea was right. And if it isn't, then I change it. But it's very painful because you want desperately to hold on to those beliefs that you had initially. So the number one thing about reality is confronting yourself. The fact that you are a limited human being with a limited cognitive abilities, you are emotion based, and so your relationship to the world is usually through thick layers of illusions that come from the media, that come from your childhood, that come from your culture that you live in, and that you have to cut through those layers, but you have to confront yourself and see yourself as the source of them. I mean, have you ever realized that you made a terrible mistake about something and had to reassess you, Ryan Holiday, and your own intelligence? Isn't it quite painful?
Yeah, that's like we'll do just about anything to avoid having to do that.
Right. So, I mean, the thing you want to do in life, I'm a great believer in looking at the evidence and looking at facts and things that are happening, information, historical context, etc. And it's the evidence and the facts. That's how I write my books. It's probably how you write your books. It's the evidence and the facts that tell me what reality is. I don't begin with my own preconceptions. I let the stories tell me what's going on.
And don't you think from an individual in terms of like who you're married to, who your friends are, and then from a leadership perspective, who is on your board of advisors, who works for you, how information bubbles up through the hierarchy? I think the other thing, if our mind is inherently sort of not our friend in that respect and tries to deceive itself, it seems like we have to build systems and relationships that counterbalance those forces so we have access to reality through somebody else's perspective. They can be like, Robert, you're being an idiot. What are you doing?
Well, that's why you read books. I mean, it's great if you could have intelligent people around you to have discussions and tell you, Ryan, that idea is shit. You're
Right.
stupid. But first of all, people will never do that because everyone is so political. Everyone is so sycophantic. They'll say, Ryan, I love your idea. Your book is fantastic. It's very hard to get objective criticism.
Sure.
When you read Nietzsche, when you read Marcus Aurelius, when you read Thucydides or any of these writers, you're getting a perspective on reality that has nothing to do with you personally, right?
Sure.
They don't know you. So you don't have to get upset if they're bringing up facts and ideas that kind of challenge you. It's kind of an exciting process. And I often love the fact of reading great books from hundreds of years ago that literally challenge how I think. You know, I'm reading now for my new book, Things of Descartes, who's somebody I don't like. His philosophy is very strange to me, but I'm forcing myself to read it. I'm entering his world, and it's really having a profound effect on me. So entering someone's different reality, that's what books do to you. They enrich you, and they show you that your own look on the world is limited. You can look through it through the lens of another culture, another gender, another period in time. And if you're not reading books, then you're going to probably be in those layers of illusion are going to be so damn thick, you're never even going to realize it.
Yeah, there's a quote I've liked from General Mattis. He says, if you haven't read hundreds of books, you're functionally illiterate. You know, we think like, oh, I can read, but the reality is if you're not reading, what good is that skill?
Right.
And I think we should talk about conspiratorial thinking, but that's so loaded that maybe I thought I'd start with something else that I think is equally prevalent. And I was just writing about, I think we're also seeing a lot of magical thinking. So conspiratorial thinking is, you know, like these people are out to get us. This is how things are operating behind the scenes. Magical thinking is, oh, the coronavirus will just disappear, or oh, a vaccine will happen and all of this will go back to normal, or you know, my ex is going to come rushing back through the door any day now. She's going to realize what a mistake she made. It feels like people are living in a fantasy world of their own kind of magical thinking.
That's very true. And, you know, it's obviously the source of falling for a con game or falling into a cult or believing in a conspiracy.
Like I'm seeing it a lot where like parents seem to think like, oh, I'm going to send my kid to school, when it's like school is important, of course, but it's also the middle of a pandemic. So just because you like something or just because you need something, if I would have wanted to visit my relatives in Europe during the Second World War, my need for doing so does not change the fact that there are German U-boats patrolling the Atlantic and I'm going to get sunk if I try to go see them.
Yeah, but if you say that, Ryan, like I tried to say on my last video about the plague, and people are going to be coming, or are you comparing the coronavirus to World War II? You know, people don't know how to think in metaphors anymore.
Sure.
You know, what I was going to say was, I don't know if this is accurate. It's a thought that came to me, and maybe I need to think it through more deeply, but I think a lot of it has to come 60, 70 years of an entertainment industry that envelops us in these stories that have like drama and then a happy ending and a consequence and a conclusion.
Sure.
And it creates this kind of way of thinking that the world is just like this. And ideas have to be entertaining. I noticed this one time when I gave a talk in Toronto, and I was one of the top speakers. There was like 12 of self-help gurus, including Anthony, what's his name?
Tony Robbins. Yeah.
And they were like yelling and stomping around the stage and yelling and had videos, and it was just like a clown show.
Right.
Right. And then I got on the stage and I had no video, and I'm just sort of talking about mastery. And then I realized you've got to entertain people. You've got to put your ideas inside these little sugar pills. You've got to make them, titillate them and excite them.
Sure.
And this has been going on through television, through radio, through television, through the internet, through social media. And now people think that the only ideas that are legitimate are these ones that fill into these little capsules, like a log line for a screenplay.
Right.
This is what reality is. You know, the pandemic, it's plandemic. It's
right.
Bill
It rhymes.
Gates,
It must be true.
it's 5G.
Yeah.
You know, it's whatever it is. These little tiny tidbits of information that people glom onto. It's very entertaining. It's sexy. It's nice to believe in. And as you say, it's complete magical thinking. I don't know if my theory is totally whack, but it came to me the other day that was sort of.
No, I think that makes sense. It's funny, Musonius Rufus, one of the Stoics, he was saying, if the audience is responding, it's a sign the philosopher is not delivering hard truths. He was like, they should be sitting there in complete silence because their mind has been blown. But no, I think you make a good point. Like, we've lost the ability, or maybe we've never had it, but we're struggling with the idea that a lot of truths are uncomfortable. A lot of truths are complicated. And a lot of times the difference between the path we should take and the path we shouldn't take, there might only be 3 or 4 percentage points of difference between the two. Like you're also seeing this in the pandemic. There's got to be some magical drug that just treats it. Or there's got to be, even masks. Like, oh, so I'm wearing a mask. Now I can just go about my normal life as if everything is fine. And it's like, no, actually, we're trying to chip away at this thing from all these different angles. There is no one silver bullet solution, but a lot of bullets that you eventually kill this thing with. And we don't seem to be able to do that. We want to glom onto the one thing, and then that's the only thing.
Yeah, I mean, a virus is a very boring thing, right? It's not a living organism. First of all, you can't anthropomorphize it.
Right.
And say, we're going to kill this thing. It's not a living organism, okay? And it's very boring. It simply lives by this rigorous math, right? If it, they have the number 1.1. If it infects more than one person at a time, it can expand exponentially.
Right.
And exponential increases are very hard for us to understand,
Sure.
and they're very powerful, right? So, and then the solution is also really kind of boring. It's so simple, and like wearing a mask and being socially distant and putting up with that kind of sacrifice for 4 months. How unmanly, how unmasculine,
Sure.
wearing a silly little mask. Oh my God. No, it's much better to believe in something a vast conspiracy, that this was some nefarious Chinese person planted it so that it would destroy America, that some cabal of people somewhere in Eastern Europe are doing this to destroy Donald Trump, or that, on and on and on, and that maybe, as you say, one thing will solve it. It's as if people can't think of two things at the same time. It's magical thinking, but it's also black and white thinking.
Right.
So if some reason it comes out that masks aren't the only solution, that, there are limits to masks, well, then that was totally false. Fauci was wrong. Trump is right. Masks are silly. No, there's nuance. Science is full of nuances. Masks help. They don't do the whole thing. You have to do this other thing. It's not very sexy or exciting. It's not like CSI Miami.
Right.
It doesn't have an exciting ending. It's not all masculine. It's not people shooting with guns. It's very simple. People don't want to believe in something so simple and boring as that,
I think this goes to the point of your book Mastery too, which is like people want to think that to become great at something, it's 100% genetics, or they want to think it's 100% hard work, or they want to think that it's, it's 10,000 hours. So if I put in 10,000 hours, I automatically become this, and the reality is it's complicated that I think a lot of these things are art more than they are a science. What I like about your book is you're like, no, it's really, really hard. But if you follow these basic principles more often than not, you will get close to where you want to end up. And I think that's also with the 48 laws of power. I hear people do this all the time. They go, but some of the laws contradict each other. So therefore the whole book must be false. It's like, yes, life is complicated. Sometimes you have to do this and sometimes you have to do that. How is that hard for you to understand?
Well, even taking it a step further, I said in the intro, and I used the last law to say I am contradicting myself. Be formless.
Right.
Don't listen to a writer. Think sometimes that maybe he's wrong. And every chapter ends with a reversal, saying that this law sucks, that you have to look at it from the opposite angle. And still people go into that black and white thinking that, he's contradicting himself. But the thing with mastery was, I was actually worried that this book would not sell at all, because the message is so kind of not what people want to hear, right? Particularly in an age where you've got your phone in front of you and it has such power and you can do whatever you want to a degree that nobody in history has ever experienced. And so it creates this belief that you can have the same kind of effect with anything in life, that things should become easily, that you should be able to hack your way quickly through, some app that comes that you get or whatever, and get power really quickly and easily. And so I thought, God, I am swimming against the tide, because I'm telling you, I'm delivering some bad news. The human brain evolved millions of years ago, and, over the course of let's say hundreds of thousands of years. And in one generation, you're not going to change the human brain because of technology. So you have to understand that our brains are designed to practice things, to learn, to be patient, develop discipline. What a bleak message. Oh, I've got to put in that many hours. Oh, I have to be disciplined. Oh, I have to learn how to fail. Oh my God, I don't want to hear that. But the good news is the book has sold well and it's really resonated with a lot of people. So I think in this culture of so much bullshit, of so many sugar pills, of feeding people so much crap, that I think a lot of people, their human nature revolts against it. Something inside says, I don't want that anymore. I want a dose of reality. I want somebody to splash some cold water on my face.
I know you're fascinated with Eastern philosophy. I think Western philosophy tends to be so logical and attempts to be so rational. Do you think there's maybe some additional merit then in the Eastern stuff, where it seems like these sort of Zen koans and these riddles and some of these questions they ask, it almost seems like they're embracing the paradoxical nature of reality and the contradictions and the unknowableness of it all?
Yeah, very much so. Where I found that the most interesting was when I did my war book and I got into strategy and Asian strategy. And you would think strategy is a very kind of heavy Western concept. You do this and this results. It's very cause and effect, consequential. Right. Step A will lead to B, would lead to C, and you plan out and you map it, von Clausewitz or whomever. And then you go into Sun Tzu, and it's like, whoa, what is he saying? It's like this reality that we're dealing with is very nuanced. It's very hard to say. It's like an art, as you say. And you take action A, and it won't lead to B. It could lead to C. It could lead to D. So where do you go? And I was confronted with this. I decided I would read a version of The Art of War that went through all of the Chinese characters. I obviously don't read Chinese, but it explained literally what each character meant. So you were reading a much more direct translation. And then it made me realize that this is not how we think, right?
Sure.
So to give you an example, he talks about potentiality of power. So you want to the art of war is to put yourself in a position, this could be in business or any strategy, where you have the potential of great momentum, of great power, right? It's not about A will lead to B, it's about a position And that
Right.
position can be somewhat nebulous. And what are these positions of power? He compares it to a stringing of a bow. That bow has potential force behind it, or a boulder on top of a mountain. And then he talks about how you can do that in warfare. And I thought, this is a whole other way of thinking. It's much more holistic, it's much more nuanced, it's much more artful, and it's more closer to reality. So to get back to your point, people think of Zen as a kind of religion, and it is theoretically a religion, something that I'm delved into very deeply. But more than anything, Zen is a philosophy of reality. It's trying to connect you to what the world really is like. And it starts from the premise, which Buddhism does, that your mind is inherently living in illusion because you're separating yourself from the world. And the world isn't like that. You actually are a part of the world that you're in. So that way of thinking deeply, deeply excites me because it contains, possibilities of things being the opposite. So something that's so extreme turns into its opposite, which is something very a very powerful part of Chinese philosophy. And in the laws of human nature, I talk about how people who appear to be so one quality are actually disguised in the opposite quality, and they continually turn into each other, the shadow side of human
Sure.
nature. These are things that I've, absorbed from years of reading Asian philosophy.
I wanted to go back to this idea of sort of people have some of these irrational beliefs. They've picked up these stories, this entertainment sort of bias that we have. Nassim Taleb, he's like, stories are powerful. And he says the only way to beat a story is to replace it with another story. Given your writing on seduction, which to me, I sort of expand seduction out from just, sort of sexual or relationship seduction. But it seems like what you're really talking about is if you want to combat some of this propensity for entertainment or this magical thinking, we have to combat it with a better story or something, you know what I mean? So how do you suggest leaders and people think about, like, if let's say you knew someone who was starting to believe in pandemic, you can't just go, that's stupid, you're an idiot. How do you walk them back from that?
It's not easy. If I had the magical answer to that, there's no magical pill for that either.
Right.
But you have to kind of enter their world first a little bit to understand, where these things come from. So, part of that, as you say, is understanding their story. And you would have to maybe watch Plandemic, which I'm afraid I did. It gave me a headache.
You weren't convinced?
No, I wasn't convinced. What I did see through was all of the tricks, the music, the narrator's voice. I totally deconstructed in my mind all the little tricks that it used to create this illusion of some kind of menace, etc. But I watched it, and I could see its seductive power in the sense of what we were talking about, where people want to believe in stories. They want a villain. They want something simple and easy to digest. They want a kind of vague conspiracy in which they can project their own little neuroses and problems. I saw its seductive appeal. And so maybe in that sense, what you're talking about is I would have to create a kind of counter narrative that also was seductive. But I don't know how you do that. Sometimes people need to be confronted with reality.
Sure.
But they need to be confronted with reality in a way that doesn't offend them, that doesn't say you're stupid. I talk about that in human nature, and I see that every day in the world. There's somebody you disagree with, you think they're wrong. In fact, you're sure of it, and you call them on it. All you're doing is making them more certain that they're right, because
Sure.
nobody wants to admit that they're stupid. So you have to be able to understand people's insecurities and what led them to believe in Plandemic in order to create a possible alternative scenario, So I don't know what that would be. I've had lucid moments where I thought of a way to maybe appeal to people in this sense of creating a kind of narrative of the science of it and the virus and kind of the excitement that comes from, actually, because one thing that irritates the hell out of me is people generally love and trust science. They do it tacitly. They do it because they drive a car and they assume that the technology is there. They
Sure.
fly in a plane. They go to a doctor when they have a disease, and they tacitly believe that there's an expert and there's science and it will solve problems for them. But science isn't sometimes very sexy, you know. It doesn't necessarily please you. It's an
Sure.
inconvenient truth. What would be your counter narrative?
Well, I don't know exactly, but like let's say we're thinking and someone lives in some Rust Belt town in a mobile home. They're not in good shape because they don't eat well because they live in a food desert. Maybe their community has been decimated by opioids, and the job market is not robust for someone who isn't educated. When you hear this idea, like let's make America great again, that taps into exactly how you're feeling. And I think the rational community, if you will, and I think that can include a whole swath of the political spectrum, seems like has not done a particularly good job. I forget who said it, but leaders are dispensers of hope. There's not really a narrative that dispenses hope, that dispenses agency, that dispenses
I
anything worth believing in.
Yeah, I misunderstood your question. Yeah, I completely believe it. I completely agree with you. And so, like a mistake that the people in the Democratic Party or on the left will make is not having a counter slogan to make America great again.
Right.
People need slogans. People love slogans. His "Build Back Better" is so awkward.
Right.
It's not the same. Doesn't have the same ring. So Democrats have always been so weak in that because they believe they're technocrats. They believe that if they just tell people the truth about the economy, but it's not seductive. And
Right.
I always go back to the only Democrat in my memory who did this was John F. Kennedy. He was a genius at marketing on the level of Trump, because that is the one element that Trump is good at. Kennedy had the new frontier. He realized that we're emerging out of the boring Eisenhower years, which really weren't so boring,
Right.
but he created this idea. And now we're returning to our pioneer myths. Our frontier is now outer space. We're going to go to the moon. We're going to be the first people to go to the moon. We're going to be so technologically advanced that we're like the pioneers in the 19th century. It was really powerful and seductive, and it worked brilliantly. I agree with you completely. You need to seduce people, and you can't be afraid of doing that. Even like Bernie Sanders, he created a cult-like following. Let's say it what it is. It's a
Right.
cult, but he was actually pretty good at creating these kind of slogans and these kind of quick ideas that people could digest about the 1%, etc. You might hate him, but he was good at it. But so many Democrats, particularly the ones that we nominate, suck at it, and they suck at it royally because they think they just need to deliver a list of things that we must do. We must do this for education, this for health. And you can just see people falling asleep as they do it. I completely agree with you. I misunderstood your question.
No,
Yeah,
no, I think it applies to the pandemic too. Like I'll talk about that in a second. But yeah, I remember in the campaign in 2016, Hillary's response to "Make America Great," which is actually, as nationalistic and stupid as it is in a lot of ways, it makes sense. There's a sort of an
sure.
immediacy that makes sense. And her response to that, instead of a better story, was "America is great because it is good." And it's like good is not as good as great. That's what words mean. And second, you're telling people who are unhappy that actually they're wrong to be unhappy because America is already great. Do you know what I mean? Like you're not you have to tell a better story, and it seems like we struggle to do that.
Well, the thing is, to be a leader today, to win an election is extremely complicated because we're very divided,
Yeah.
right? We have
Right.
these little niche groups, these little beliefs, identity politics, or however you want to term it. And even on the right, they have their little niche groups. So to unite the country to win an election, you have to create a narrative. You have to tell people, this is what it means to be American.
Right.
And nobody ever does that. I can't recall in my lifetime, you could say Trump somehow does, a Ronald Reagan perhaps is an example. But what does it mean to be an American in 2020? It's a very strange time we're going through. We're a very diverse country with all of these, it's not the same in Wisconsin as in California and New York. And we have these different isolated pockets. What will unite us? What will create a grand sense of we are a country? We don't need to hate each other. I can actually appreciate a Trump voter in Michigan. He's an American as I am. He has the same frustrations with the healthcare system that I do. What unites us? How do you create a narrative that makes people emotional, that makes people actually want to think that this is what the future of America? Damn it, if I could just get inside of a politician's head to create that narrative. That's like the one thing that's so missing, and there's so much potential power behind that.
Well,
And
no,
it's
I was
scary power. It's not like a Nazi type power.
but it is very volatile power. Like, I mean, we're recording this the day after the 19th anniversary of 9/11, and
Yeah.
to think, there was all that energy, those planes crash into those towers, and government, the United States government, has an opportunity. What story are we going to tell ourselves about this event, and then how are we going to direct that energy? The war on terror is a story. It's just probably the wrong story, and we ended up telling a story that cost America trillions of dollars, thousands of lives, and almost certainly made us less safe than we were before. And why is China ascendant and America somewhat stagnant? It's China didn't spend several trillions of dollars for very little gain in the Middle East over the last 20 years.
Yeah, I mean, the narrative that you create has to be reality based to some extent, and it has to be pro-social, you know. So the reality, the narrative of this is our enemy, we must destroy them, the war on terror, was kind of the false way of uniting people. So I agree with you. There is a kind of cult-like Nazi way of uniting people behind a cause that is very evil, that can take the energy in a crowd and can make it very, very dangerous. So yeah, I agree with you. But if I'm thinking about a narrative nowadays that unite people, it's look, we're the most powerful country. Well, we used to be. I don't know how long, much longer we can say that. But in quotes, we're the most technologically powerful country in the world. Look what we've done. Look at the science. Look what we've created. Look at our business. Look at our culture, etc. And why can't we see this? This is our new forefront, the new frontier to do Kennedy, to bring back to Kennedy. We're going to solve all the incredible problems in the world through being a magnet for the greatest thinkers in the world. We're going to solve global warming, and we're going to make it economically profitable. You can make that narrative pro-social. It doesn't have to be evil and cult-like. And I think Kennedy's was like that, or even Reagan's to some extent,
No, I totally agree. When you see all this happening, and it's aggravating and it's frustrating and it's disappointing, how does one prevent themselves from giving in to despair? I mean, that's something I think about. Like, how do you not just go, this is crazy, I'm going to be like Montaigne, and I'm just going to retire to my tower and read my books for the rest of my life?
Well, that is kind of what I'm doing. I'm kind of being like Montaigne. I am kind of retired to my tower and working on my next book. I mean, I'm an exception, so it's not really fair for me to say because, thank God I have books to write and I can absorb myself in over 3,000 years of history and get outside of this time. But, some perspective will help. I had a chapter in my Laws of Human Nature about the generation phenomenon. There's a great book called Generations by these two writers that came out in the 90s that show these incredible patterns through history that happen in sequences of 4. And so there's a kind of a crisis generation, which I believe is what is millennials, people who lived through this crash of '08, and now this. And then there's the revolutionary generation where something new is created, where people are so tired of what's going on in the world, particularly young people, because it's only young people that ever really create change, and change is very necessary in this world. And so the only hopeful thing is that I think young people are so sick of the narrative they've been fed about the world, particularly from boomers, about this is what America is, this is what prosperity is, this is what our future is, that they're so sick of it, they're so tuned out of it, that if they could ever get the energy together, they could create something very powerful and new. My only hope is that people are going to get tired of this And that this is what has saved us in the past, that we've gone through these deep moments, and sometimes these moments can last well over 100 years. There can be the dark ages in our history that last 4 centuries or something like that, you know. But at a point is reached where the human spirit rebels and returns to its origin and returns to something powerful and healthy. Because we know we don't like, you know, if you eat a lot of junk food, you feel sick. Your body feels sick.
Sure.
If you consume a lot of bullshit information and things that are just entertainment on the internet, you kind of also feel sick, like you're disconnected from who you are, from your own body, from the world. You rebel. You're sick of it. And so we need, in some ways, I don't want to, people are going to kill me for saying this, but we also somewhat need a kind of second revolution in America of, you know, bringing all of the great things of our country and updating them to where the world is right now. And my only hope is that young people are so sick of the way things are that they're going to be the catalysts of change. I could be wrong, and it may never happen, but that's what makes me not want to kill myself right now.
So let's say that some of this energy does come together, and maybe there have been moments, right? There have been marches in the streets, whether it's about George Floyd or whether it's about the Parkland shooting or whether it's about climate change or the Women's March or whatever it is. It seems like we get these moments of energy, but the wave crests before it has a chance to do anything. And I think part of the reason that seems to happen is that the entrenched interests are so good and so used to sort of parrying these blows that they don't end up landing. And so I'm curious, like, what's your advice to, you know, an incipient activist movement that is fighting an enemy that is not playing by the rules? Like if you're Belarus right now and you are up against the full power of the state, what do you do?
You do what you're doing, and those are brilliant, beautiful examples, and I'm following it with great interest. I mean, look what happened in Ukraine. I was recently in Ukraine. Ukraine's an amazing, a beautiful country. People are very smart there. There's a lot of great things of technology that are coming from Ukraine. They overthrew one of the most corrupt oligarchies in modern times. Now, things aren't perfect there. There's still levels of corruption. They're still fighting it. But, you know, I was reading in the paper this morning in the Washington Post about somebody I think you really need to include in your book on courage.
Okay.
I think he's the most courageous person in the world today, and that's Alexei Navalny, right? The guy who was poisoned by the Russians.
Sure.
Unbelievably brave. Read the Washington Post article today.
Okay.
Unbelievably brave what he's put up with. Completely incorruptible. And his strategy for fighting the most entrenched, you think it's bad maybe in the United States, try fighting against Putin in Russia, and you'll see that you're hitting a block of cement more than anything. But it's not impossible. And the solution is, because I've researched this a lot and thought a lot about it, is visibility. You need to be out there in the streets, and you need to not let your energy dissolve, and you need to be constantly publicizing the corruption, and you can't be naive. So what you're talking about is entrenched powers co-opting the anger on the streets. And so Citibank will have an ad saying, "We're all with you, you know, George Floyd, blah, blah, blah." Right. They're co-opting it. They're co-opting your energy, and they're turning it into their own thing. You must call them out on that. You must not be seduced by these little crumbs that they try and throw at you. You need to keep your narrative together, which is there is rampant corruption in this country. There are oligarchs, wherever country you're talking about. You need to be revealing that for what it is. And if you look at Alexei Navalny and why he's so brilliant, you talk about seduction. He creates these YouTube videos. I don't know if you ever watched any of them.
No.
They have them with subtitles. They're fantastic. He has managed to create these I don't know, 20-minute, I don't know how long they are, I don't remember, videos detailing the corruption in Russia. He gets these drones to pass over oligarchs' mansions, and he films their ponds full of ducks and swans and their tennis courts and their swimming pools, and he puts it together in a really powerful video and says, "Look, Russians, this is what they're stealing. They're stealing your money, and this is how our president, Medvedev, has $1.4 billion put into his estate. While meanwhile, you are starving and you are dying from the pandemic, et cetera, et cetera. They're powerful. So you have to be entertaining and you have to be constantly visible. If you're marching in the streets, you can't let the energy dissolve. And you have to create a narrative that's strong, and you can't be naive. You can't let yourself be seduced by these people who are trying to co-opt you.
And I've been fascinated about the civil rights movement lately, and reading a lot about it. I think maybe one of the things we get wrong about it too is that, we think it's like, oh, Martin Luther King just took people to the streets, and so we think like, oh, what we need to get change is just to have a lot of protesters or demonstrators. Like when you really think about what like the Montgomery bus boycott was, or some of his garbage boycotts, he wasn't just demonstrating, but he was exerting real pressure that the leaders had to alleviate, and the only way to alleviate it was to get into his demands. And so I think that's one, like, we do this. Remember, after 2016, there was a March for Science in America or something like that. That's not exerting any pressure on anyone, and there's no goals of that move. Do you know what I mean? We just think that organization is key, but there has to be another component.
Well, I mean, but Martin Luther King definitely had what I'm talking about. He definitely wanted to keep these things visible constantly in the present. Sure. But what you're saying is true. You have to be strategic. That's the difference.
Yes.
Right? And Martin Luther King was a brilliant strategist. So he understood that the goal of his campaigns were the white liberals sitting in front of their television sets in Janesville, Wisconsin, or in Illinois, right? Mm-hmm. They're going to see images of children 12 years old being beaten by brutal black cops and with their dogs, etc. And they're going to be awakened to the reality of America. And to do that, he had to make things extremely visible. He had to be constantly out on the streets, and he had to even provoke the other side. So one of the things that, we tend to create these saints, and Martin Luther King was not a saint, but he was very human. But he had a decision in one of his rallies whether somebody proposed letting school children, 11, 12 years old, participate in a demonstration, which would probably end up violent. And people said, oh, Martin, you can't do that. That's terrible. That's not ethical. And this very religious man, this preacher, this priest, said, no, that's the right idea. And he did it. And it was very, very powerful. It was one of the key moments in the movement. So yeah, there are times when you can't exert pressure, like you want police departments to change, and you're out on the streets. Or let's say the election is, there's fraud, and there's like the 2000 movement where the Brooks Brothers revolution occurred, and they all, tried to change the results in Florida. You know what I'm referring to?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the leverage in that particular case is only going to be by demonstration in mass numbers. I mean, where both components are important. So in Belarus, it's the fact that 100,000 people in a small country are in the streets of Minsk, basically running the risk of being beaten or killed. And that is incredibly powerful. It has a snowball effect where everybody wakes up. So visibility and being on the streets is one component that's very important, but you have to also be strategic and do what you're saying.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And that does seem like something people who have kind of turned up their noses at your books right now, especially millennials, I think need to be reading, because when the other side is not playing by the rules, although you do have to maintain the moral high ground, which you talk about. It's like, on the one hand, you got to be kind of a Lyndon Johnson. You have to take the moral high ground here, but then in the smoke-filled rooms or in secret, you got to know how to grab somebody by the balls and twist, and I think we're lacking that.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking about it today when I was reading the paper, and I don't remember what the story is, where I'm seeing Republicans can play very dirty.
Yeah.
They play this kind of asymmetric warfare where they're willing to do anything when it comes to limiting voting rights or working with the post office. They'll do anything to keep on power. And the Democrats, I don't want to get involved in that kind of nasty stuff. It's too dirty. We're pure, blah, 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 blah. Man, I've been hating that for my whole life. It makes me sick. Read about Franklin Delano Roosevelt one of our greatest presidents, and one of our most liberal. That guy, the person who wrote the best biography, called it The Lion and the Fox. He was Machiavelli incarnate. He was incredibly strategic. Nobody played more hardball than Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he knew how to do it, and he was successful at it. And so, that's what the world is like. And if you're going to organize a movement, you have to realize that your hands are going to have to get a little bit dirty. And if even Martin Luther King was willing to get his hands dirty in a demonstration, and even Gandhi, I talked about in my war book, Gandhi was incredibly strategic. He knew that if he did passive resistance and they were being beaten up by white British people, policemen, those in England would be seeing this and they'd be revolted by it, disgusted by it. He was willing to have that happen. He was very strategic. If Gandhi and Martin Luther King were strategic people who knew how to play tough and hardball, why can't you get off your high horse and be more strategic and be willing to get your fingers a little bit dirty and play a little bit dirty? And you're not going to lose yourself. You're going to win.
Well, no, it's like Bill Belichick talks about the Patriot way and no ego and all that. And then, he's also looking for every possible thing he can do up to the line. And sometimes he's willing to see if he can get away with crossing the line. You know what I mean? And that's what it takes to be dominant at that level, I think.
Or look at Churchill in World War II. Read the book I recommended to you, The Bodyguard of Lies. A great book. The levels of deception and these things that kind of cross an ethical boundary that you would normally never do in wartime, he was willing to do because the stakes were so high. Well, the stakes are pretty high right now, and sometimes you have to be willing to go a little bit past that boundary.
So I thought maybe we'd close with some of maybe to bring it full circle. It strikes me that there are some people who are just sort of being manipulated because they're uneducated. They're being manipulated because they don't have the training that we're talking about. They're being manipulated because they're vulnerable, whatever. And then but it also seems like there's a part of this that it's people. There's that quote, you can't con an honest man. It seems like some of the people that are falling for this, they should know better. And in fact, why they don't know better is because they think they're the ones that are getting the better deal out of it. Do you know what I mean? It's like, I think Machiavelli says, he who deceives is most easily deceived.
Well, look at Trump and Bob Woodward. Trump is the one who's incredibly deceptive, who likes to, let's just call a spade a spade. He lies a lot. I don't think anybody, even a Trump supporter, would deny that. And here comes Bob Woodward, who kind of says, I'm going to write a book. And Bob Woodward has 18 books behind him revealing what he does. He rips you to pieces. He shows your innards. He makes you look as ugly as you can. Right. And he agrees to it. The deceiver was deceived. Con artists are often conned. I have the story in the 48 Laws of the greatest con man that ever lived in America, Yellow Kid Vile, and how he was conned by these two very beautiful women on a boat once. And he realized that, I'm very much open to it. The idea is, when we look at the world, we like to think of evil people and victims. It's part of our black and white magical thinking. There are evil people out there, and there are poor oppressed victims. And the thing about the way I try to show in con artists or with cults is I'm fascinated by the psychology of people who fall for it. And it's not so much that they are victims in this particular instance. They want to believe in the con. There's an old Latin expression, I wrote it down here, mundus vult decipex, ergo decipiatur. The world wants to be deceived, therefore deceive them, is the expression. People want to be fed some convenient, beautiful truth. You're going to have easy money. We're going to do this little thing here, and you're going to get thousands of dollars without ever doing anything, right? Wow. Okay, I'll do it. Or whatever the story is, whatever the con is, you want to believe in it. You're a sucker. You're a dupe because of human nature. And we all have that part of us. You want to believe in this easy route to power and money, right? So the end thing is you have to be responsible for yourself. You can't be whining that you were the victim, that you were conned, or that you were deceived. Of course, you'll very rarely ever admit that. You have to build rational defenses in your mind. You have to be willing, and this comes from a lot of reading, to question everything, to question your own beliefs, to say, am I actually in a cult? Maybe I am. Have I actually been conned? Maybe I, Robert Greene, have been conned, and I have been conned myself personally. You have to look at yourself. That is the last line of defense for any kind of world we live in with so much deceiving and conning going on.
Yeah, I remember you tell a story. I think it's in 48 Laws of Power about this con they do where they approach someone and they say, "Hey, do you want to fix a boxing match with me?"
Yeah, yeah.
And then you're in the you think you're tricking other people, and then they stage this elaborate ruse where one of the boxers gets killed, and then they flee with the money, but you don't ever tell anyone about it because you would have to admit that
Right.
you were fixing a boxing match.
Yeah. It's the old Russian trick of kompromat. So if you're compromised in the actual con, you're never going to come out and go to the authorities because A, it shows how stupid you were, and B, you're admitting guilt on your own part. So that's one of the oldest cons in the book. Yeah.
Yeah, no, compromat is a fascinating and very relevant thing these days. And I think I was reading an interview with an FBI agent, and they were saying, it's not, people think that to be compromised means that you're a traitor, like you're somehow some double agent. And he's saying being compromised just means there's a reason that you can't be fully honest. It's like you have a secret, or you have some shame, or you have something you don't want to admit. And that's what it is. And I think, when people talk about this election interference and all this stuff, like, it's not just politics. I mean, there's college professors who've been taking research money from China. We have, like, this is why I think ethical lines and holding yourself to a high standard is so important. You don't want to be compromised, because once you're compromised, you're not yourself anymore.
Well, it's the chapter in 48 Laws of Power about your reputation.
Mm-hmm.
And there is an element that isn't maybe so ethical in that it's a power thing, but it is ethical in the sense that your reputation is your most important thing that you have. And if you sully it in the least sense, particularly in this era with so much visibility in social media, where one wrong step will resonate, the waves will go in a matter of minutes across social media. You have to be very careful. And you have to see that there are all kinds of compromising factors out there. So yeah, I myself have been in a position where people have been offering me money from somewhat dubious sources. And I say, no way, because I know it'll come out at some point. And people will go, oh, look, Robert Greene, how can we trust his books? He's actually receiving money from this somewhat corrupt group or that somewhat corrupt group. I'm not saying that I'm pure, but I'm very much aware that I myself have been the target of compromised campaigns before. And I take a step back and I go, no, my reputation is the most important thing that I have.
Well, no, and that's why, controlling your ego is so important. I not at the same level, but every once in a while, you get a television request to be on RT or something. And on the one hand, you're like, oh, that would be good. And then you're like, I know why this is happening, right? And, or we can also corrupt ourselves. Like, how many people get themselves in trouble because 3 years ago they said something dumb on Twitter because they couldn't control their emotions, and now, now they can't be president or whatever it is.
We tend to separate ourselves from other people and point fingers. And I know how easy it is to fall for these things. Mm-hmm. I know, like, if you're in a group situation, you're working in an office like we have when we were in American Apparel, and we recently discussed this, the pressures that you're feeling to conform and to maybe do things that you normally wouldn't do because you're being asked to do it. And the group pressure is very powerful. And then you'll let slip some of those ethical principles that you have. I know I've felt that pull myself, and I maybe even at some points have slipped a little bit. I'll admit that. I understand how difficult it can be, but as you say, at some point you look at yourself and you go, this is who I am. This is what I stand for. It's more important than any kind of momentary friction I'm going to get from the boss or from whomever, and I'm not going to go past that particular limit.
No, I love it. Anything else we should cover that we haven't covered?
I don't know. I don't know. I think we covered the world as it is. How about you?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's so hard to know where we are in the sort of levels of emergency. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yes.
when is this the early sign and there's still something that can be done about it to take it out of the complicated political context? Let's say you're convinced that we're entering an economic bubble. So you could sell right at the beginning of the bubble and be totally safe, but as they say, the market can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent. And so there's this tricky balance of like, do you ride it up, and risk maybe taking it too far? Do you risk taking your chips off the table too early? And so I think in a political and in a social context, we're in this weird environment where, where are we on the spectrum from, America, the dream, and, Russia or Germany? And how do you know?
Well, if I had that answer, I would be the most powerful man in the universe.
Right.
We don't have perspective. To be someone who writes books and whatever, you have to have humility and realize there are limits to what you know. So I read a lot of history and I see a lot of patterns, and a part of me says that things are pretty damn dire, that certain guardrails in our democracy are frittering away. But to be honest with you, what scares me more than anything is the levels of irrationality and magical thinking, and people not able to kind of look at themselves and be somewhat self-aware, and that disconnect from reality. And as I say, I kind of think it's from decades of being entertained and being kind of brainwashed is what frightens me the most. Because even if, let's say, Trump is gone, let's say people are coming in, they're fixing things, etc., that's not going to change this consciousness that people have
Sure.
that is kind of like the equivalent of eating junk food. So that part of it makes me a little bit depressed, because you need to change people's consciousness more than anything on a deep level. And the other thing that's very frightening now, that we've seen before in history, it's not the first time, is the extremity of the partisanship, of the tribalism that we're going through. And, I could point through other moments in history that have been equally tribal, of course, before social media, which has only exacerbated it. But it's kind of like this hall of mirrors that you enter. You can't argue with people anymore,
Right.
because the moment you say, this is what I think, and you're challenging them, oh, you're just this, you're just a liberal, you're just a Trump supporter, you've drunk the Kool-Aid. I get that all the way. Oh, Robert, you've drunk the Kool-Aid. Whereas in fact, you're the one that's drunk the Kool-Aid. But the people who drink the Kool-Aid think everybody else are the ones that have drunk it. That's the nature of it. Even
Right.
in Jonestown, where the expression comes, you drank the Kool-Aid, they thought everybody outside of Jonestown had drunk their own Kool-Aid. That's the kind of world we live in. It's like Alice in Wonderland, which Jared Kushner was saying, ironically enough, kind of is the book that encapsulates the Trump presidency. But that's kind of the world we're living in.
No, gaslighting is the operative term too, not just because of what it means. Like it's rooted in the story of a man who's sort of flicking off the gas lights and slowly
Yeah.
tricking, I think, his spouse about it. But if you expand that out, it's like some gas is leaked into the room and it's made us all irrational, and we can't think straight. And the worst part is we can't think straight, but we think that we are thinking straight. And that about sums up the nightmare that we're in.
I think that about sums it up. You're right. I can't think of a better way of putting it.
Well, it was amazing to talk to you, and let's do this again for sure.
Yeah, and you have a book coming out, don't you?
I do, yeah. Lives of the Stoics, September 29th.
I encourage all of my followers and readers. If you don't, I'm sure all of you read Ronald Holiday, but you really should go out. This is going to be a great book. When is it come out?
September 29th.
Okay,
Thank you. I appreciate it.
welcome.